Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to introduce Rebecca Rego Barry for her talk on Carolyn Wells, the once famous, now forgotten author and book collector. All but unknown today, Carolyn Wells wrote 82 detective novels in the early 20th century, becoming one of the original grande dames of mystery. She also wrote in other genres, children's, young adult, poetry, and humor, totaling more than 180 books over the course of her career. Some were adapted into silent films by Thomas Edison, and some became bestsellers, yet she faded into obscurity after her death in 1942. However, an enigmatic bookplate found in a first edition of Walden, which had belonged to Wells, who was a serious book collector, prompted Rebecca to embark on a full-scale investigation into Wells's life and literary legacy. The paper trail led to Rahway, New Jersey, where Wells was born and is buried, to New York City's Upper West Side, where she spent her final 25 years, to the Library of Congress, where her world-class collection of rare books now resides, and to many other public and private collections where exciting discoveries unfolded and ultimately resulted in her first ever biography. In addition to her new book, The Vanishing of Carolyn Wells, Investigations into a Forgotten Mystery Author, Rebecca is the author of Rare Books Uncovered, published in 2015. The former longtime editor of Fine Books and Collections magazine, she is now the Director of Communications at the Rab Collection. Please welcome Rebecca Rego Barry.
All right, thank you, Terry. Thank you all for having me. Oh, there she is, okay. I'm so excited to talk to you all today about Carolyn Wells. Especially so at the New York International Antiquarian Book Fair, as you're going to hear in just a moment. But I did want to ask, had anyone here ever heard of Carolyn Wells before this talk? Or? Okay, a few. I mean, you heard just a little bit about her biography in that intro, but Carolyn Wells was a librarian, then a poet, a humorist, a magazine editor, a writer of children's and young adult literature, a silent film writer, a Broadway playwright and librettist, a puzzle master, an anthologist, the first editor of the Best American Mystery Stories series, and a mystery novelist, and a book collector. She was acquainted with 4 presidents and many of the authors and artists of the early 20th century, including Mark Twain, at whose birthday party she gave the keynote poem, Rudyard Kipling, Frances Hodgson Burnett, and on and on. She was also a book collector whose renowned collection of Walt Whitman now resides at the Library of Congress. And that, the book collecting part, is where we're going to start with her book plates. Oh, Meg, I'm doing this wrong. There we go, okay. Because that's how it all started for me. So as Terry just mentioned, for a long time I was the editor of a magazine called Fine Books and Collections, which covers the world of book collecting. And so as part of that job, I would go to all the book fairs. And in 2011, I was at this very fair and was with my husband, who was, while I was off sort of chatting with some booksellers, he was off buying me a first edition of Henry David Thoreau's Walden as a surprise birthday gift, which is the best birthday gift I've ever received in my life. It's been my favorite piece of American literature since I was like 15, so really amazing gift. And when I opened it a few weeks later, there were a couple of book plates in it because it had obviously been owned by several people over its history. And the one that you see here on the right was the most prominent book plate, and that's the book plate of Carolyn Wells. And it's really interesting. You've got this sort of Renaissance-clad woman, and she's holding in her hands this little gargoyle-like creature, which I come to know as the Lincoln Imp. He's on a cathedral in the UK. And she has her little motto in the circle behind her, I wonder why, and then her name there at the bottom, Carolyn Wells. And so I was intrigued, interested, but, just didn't think that much of it. I thought at the time it was unusual because there weren't that many female book collectors at the beginning of the 20th century who would have had enough money and enough agency to be their own collector, have their own book plate, that kind of thing. So, interesting, but I kind of just shelved it and thought, well, cool thing, and I own it, and great. End of story. And before I go on, I'm going to say that this is a variant of her bookplate on the left, which the imp becomes much more prominent for some reason. she really identified. It was almost like her spirit animal. So in 2018, 2019, I had heard that a British publisher was going to put out a reprint of a book called Murder in the Bookshop, which some of you may know. Like if anybody in here collects books about books or bibliomysteries, you know this title. And so they were going to reprint this book for the first time in like 50 years. And that was kind of my aha moment, because I thought, oh, this woman, she was an author, she was a book collector, and she wrote a book about a rare book collector getting murdered in a bookseller, in his bookseller's library, basically. So I just decided at that moment, okay, I'm going to do a little research. I'm going to write an article for this magazine called Crime Reads about how this woman who is a rare book collector parlays her knowledge of the industry of rare books into writing this bibliomystery, which actually became a New York Times bestseller in 1936 when it was published. So in the course of writing this article, I interviewed a woman named Margaret Stetz, who's a professor at the University of Delaware. And she clued me into the fact that Carolyn was not only a mystery author and a book collector, but she was also a hugely famous humorist in the early part of the 20th century, like 1900s, 1910s, 1920s. And so this was a whole other avenue of Carolyn's life that I knew nothing about. And so I kind of thought at that moment, I wonder if I could just do some more research and find out more about her. And I feel like this is a person that I should know. I mean, I studied literature, I worked in the rare book trade, I feel like I should know her name. So I started Googling around, and I found that even though she wrote tons of stuff, at least 180 books and articles and films and all the other stuff, there was very little written about her, and what I could find, like dates were wrong and places were wrong, so it was really hard to find any actual correct information. So I started, and I couldn't find a central archive, I couldn't find an estate of any kind, it was just kind of just blank. So I started making a list of her published books, and I bought a used copy of her autobiography, and kind of started there. And that was March 2020, if you can't see in the fine print there at the bottom, so we're really talking about the beginning of the pandemic, and so this is how I spent the first 6-9 months of the pandemic, kind of just researching Carolyn Wells, the beginning of this. And here we go. So among the first things I learned is that she was born in a town called Rahway, New Jersey, which is a central New Jersey suburb. She was born in 1862. You can see her on the map. Rahway's not very far from where we are right now, and you can see there on the right, that's actually the Wells family home, which has only been owned by 2 families since she left it. And so the Wells family was middle class, if not upper middle class. Her youth consisted of social clubs and church events and amateur theatricals and that kind of stuff, summer vacations to the Jersey Shore and the Catskills. They weren't quite Newport level wealth, but maybe just below that level. And they did have quite a lovely home. And so it was a prosperous, privileged, pretty life, although not without some hardships. She actually lost her older brother and her younger sister to childhood diseases. And when her younger sister died of scarlet fever, she also had it at the same time, and she lost hearing in one of her ears, which is a disability that she then, had for the rest of her life. Also, when she was about that age, same age when the scarlet fever happened, 5 or 6, she wrote this little booklet, which is actually at Ohio State University Library right now. When I started Googling around to all these different places and reaching out to university libraries and special collections, found that the Ohio State University Libraries has, for whatever reason, a small trove of material, and it is quite small. There's no, like I said, no central archive, so this research has really been like a box here, a couple of letters over here, one manuscript over here, and then trying to kind of follow them to their endpoints. So Ohio State has a nice little group of material, and one of the things that they have is this little book that she created when she was 6. It's called 1 Year at Our Boarding School. It was made around 1868, and she writes in the preface here, the author of this book would say that if it meets with such approval as did that little magazine, the Children's Weekly, she will be perfectly satisfied. Which just really automatically reminded me of the Bronte family juvenilia, if anybody is familiar with that. They used to do the same kind of thing, make these little books. And she was, in fact, born Carrie B. Wells, but she changed her name to Carolyn when she became an author, which is probably just to try to sort of make herself look more important, I guess. But I think the booklet is really fantastic evidence of how precocious she was, maybe destined to be an author. She did not grow up in a bookish family. In fact, her father curtailed what she was allowed to read. But they did do a lot of games and puzzles in her house when she was a kid, and that kind of followed her for the rest of her life. Puzzles. She was really into like puzzle making and wordplay, and that's something that you'll see again and again. She did not go to college. She refused. It was offered to her, but she refused. Instead, she set a course of study for herself that included German, French, history, botany, and 3 summers worth of Shakespeare in Amherst, Massachusetts. And during one of those summers, she actually was invited to go have tea with Lavinia Dickinson. So she got to meet Lavinia Dickinson. Here are some great photos of her from the 1890s. I mean, that dress, I just love it. She's nearing 30 in these photos, and I don't want to say she has few prospects, but there were not many jobs considered to be, quote unquote, acceptable for a woman of her time and of her class. So, and she hadn't married, which is probably the path her parents would have expected and hoped her to take. And I don't know if she felt pressure to do something, but she ended up taking a part-time job in a library, the Rahway Public Library, in 1890. And she had a wonderful mentor there. So the job gave her the opportunity to travel to all these other libraries and to just read nonstop. She talks in her memoir about the fact that all she did at this job for 12 years was order books and then sit there and read them, which, you know, any librarian today would be appalled if you suggested that that was their job. But that's what she did. And one of the most important things that she did at this job was she learned about, quote unquote, little magazines, these sort of artsy, progressive magazines that sprung up in the shadow of the bigger mainstream magazines at the time. And she realized that, you know, maybe she had a literary bug, and she started writing little bits of wordplay and poems and prose and sending it away to the editors of these, quote unquote, little magazines. One actually wasn't quite so little, was Puck, which many of you might have heard. It was published here in New York City out of that Puck building downtown, humor magazine that was pretty famous, and she was published there all the time. Again, it was short prose, light and witty. She was like Dorothy Parker 20 years before Dorothy Parker, basically. Fashion was a favorite topic for her. I mean, look at that dress she was wearing. So she was not quite a woman about town, because she is still living and does, in fact, live with her parents under their roof until she's 55. But she is trying to forge this literary career for herself. She fell in love with this magazine here on the right called The Lark, which was a really avant-garde magazine published out of San Francisco. And she pitched the editor there, a man named Gillette Burgess, who responded by telling her, quote, "No women contributors." So she took that as a challenge. Instead of just saying, like, forget him, she took it as a challenge, and she kept writing to him, kept pitching him, and they actually developed a friendship. He ended up not only publishing her work in The Lark like a year later, but they became longtime friends, longtime collaborators. She was also the editor of a magazine called The Daily Tatler. This was another quote-unquote little magazine. It was only 8 pages, and it contained basically snarky literary commentary. It's considered to be the first daily literary magazine in the United States. I don't consider by who, but that's what it's known as. It only lasted 13 days, so it was too much work. But she only got the job. She was the only woman, obviously, who was one of the editors, and she only got the job because she had written to the publisher a few months before and asked for it. And she wrote to him that he was looking. She wrote to him. She heard he was looking for an editor, and that quote, "A bright woman is better than a dull man and much cheaper," which is unfortunately still true. But so that was 1896. And it was a really big year for Carolyn, because that same year, in fact, the same autumn, she's published in the Chapbook, which is a magazine some of you may have heard of. It's another one of these little magazines, but one that had a pretty big reputation. And then within a month or two, they published, that same publisher, Stone and Kimball, publishes her first book, which you can see there in the middle at the Sign of the Sphinx, which is, it says a book of charades, but it's not charades in the way that we would know the word charades. It's actually riddles, like wordplay and riddles. And this is the moment, 1896, November of 1896, where her literary career just takes off. And she keeps her day job, but she keeps writing, and the amount that she produced is just, it's hard to fathom. So she goes from writing for all these little magazines, which she continues doing, but then all of a sudden she's showing up on the pages of Life and Harper's and the Saturday Evening Post, and it is literally every week, like several times a week in various publications. She's just all over the place. In fact, her constant presence prompted this question from some reporters: have women a sense of humor? Which I really, when I started seeing these articles, have women a sense of humor, I thought it reminded me so much of a question I heard maybe 10 years ago, right? Are women funny? Which 10 years ago people were saying, are women funny? And I think Time magazine said Tina Fey answered that question, are women funny? But 100 years ago, Carolyn Wells was the person who answered that. Like when they said, oh, are women funny? Well, yeah, there's one lady who's funny, her name is Carolyn Wells. There would be lists of like, here are the 10 famous humorists in America in like 1910. And you'd have 9 men and you'd have 1 woman, Carolyn Wells. So, and she was famous for doing this kind of, limericks were one of her major forms. And this one, some of you may know, this tutor who tooted a flute is kind of a famous limerick, I guess. That's her work. That was published in Life magazine in 1898. But then she also did some kind of pricklier and very bookish types of poems and prose. And the one that's here, Primitive Literature, is only a section of it here, but I love how it ends with this zinger. What makes a book a phenomenal success? Much bad, much pad, and much ad. I could fill an entire book with her bookish poems and prose and parody. She hated Henry James, like with a passion, and she would go after him all the time. She actually had a series called The Bookshop Girl, and in this series, the Bookshop Girl would be telling people to read Henry James, but then saying things like, well, you know, you could have, when you're cutting the pages, it'll give you such a break from having to read any more of the words on the page, like because she found him so long-winded. But during this time period, this decade between like 1896 and 1906, she's working on like 6, 7, 8 books per year, and with as many publishers. She's just all over the place. And one of the places that she is very prominently is writing for children. And when I say writing for children, I mean it in the same forms: puzzles, verse, short stories. Same thing she was doing in the larger magazines, she's doing for children. And some of you may recognize St. Nicholas, very famous magazine at the time, published by Scribner, kind of a literary magazine for children. And she did a puzzle column there for like over a decade. This is one of her really quirky puzzles, a bicycle puzzle. Like I said before, puzzles were something it's like kind of a through line in her life. And just kind of go on a small tangent. Later in the 1920s, she became an early crossword puzzle editor for the Midweek Pictorial, which was a publication published by the New York Times, but not published in the New York Times paper proper. So I kind of try to make an argument that she was their first crossword puzzle editor. But she was published by the New York Times as a crossword puzzle editor, but only in this thing called the Midweek Pictorial. But in any case, there was a growing need for what Carolyn was creating, which was stories for children and young adults. That whole market was really changing in that time period, and what she was able to offer were sort of quote-unquote wholesome stories, especially for girls. And one of them is called The Story of Betty. That starts on the pages of St. Nicholas in 1898, published the next year. But her most famous was one called the series called the Patty Books, which some of you may recognize. There were 17 of these published between 1901 and 1919, but they were reprinted for decades. Actually, some of the readers I've actually heard from about my book came to Carolyn Wells from the Patty Books, and it's because grandmothers handed them down, mothers handed them down, and so many that I was able to look at online in special collections libraries and digital libraries have these beautiful inscriptions in them from like family members, you know, to Eleanor, love mama, you know, Christmas 1940, that kind of thing. So Again, she was just really considered acceptable, good reading for girls, which at least one scholar thinks, before Carolyn Wells, the only person who was kind of cornering that market was Louisa May Alcott. This is just a smattering of the books that she was working on at the time. You may be familiar with some of them. But in 1902, Carolyn actually quit her library job after 12 years. She's 40 years old, and she decides to pursue this second career as a full-time writer. And that is one of the things I kind of most admire about her, because by the standards of her time, 40 was ancient. So to kind of say to herself, you know what, I'm going to give up this day job and I'm just going to go for it, I find just really admirable. She's writing poetry. Baubles and the Jingle Book are poems, and nonsense, that kind of thing. Emily Emmons is an illustrated novel. Folly in the Forest and Folly for the Wise, these are fairy books. Fairy books very much in the vein of like Lewis Carroll and Edward Lear. Those were people that she really admired, their writing. So it's kind of, they're books for children, but any adult can enjoy them as well. The Matrimonial Bureau is one of her first adult novels. And then up there on the right, the Nonsense Anthology is another one some people may be familiar with, because she actually did 5 anthologies in the same uniform design. And the New York Times wrote of them, anthologies before Carolyn Wells took to making them were grave and formidable things. Her satire anthology, parody anthology, and nonsense anthology changed all that. So again, this was just another talent she had, cutting and pasting basically poems and bits of prose into these anthologies and then marketing them for a middle-class audience, and it worked. A major part of her Act Two was writing mystery novels, detective novels, and that's what she would become best known for in her lifetime. Carolyn loved Arthur Conan Doyle. He was really popular, obviously, in the 1890s, and she loved Anna Katharine Green, who's considered the mother of American detective fiction. So those were the 2 main inspirations for her. She sees her first detective story into print in 1905, and then others begin to appear in newspapers, magazines, and then finally in books, like this one, The Clue, 1909. She excelled in the country house locked room variety of mystery, a decade before Agatha Christie would start doing the same, and develops this scholarly detective named Fleming Stone, who kind of swoops in at the 11th hour to solve the crime. So she wrote 82 mystery novels. Fleming Stone starred in 61 of them. So she did have some other detectives, but he was the main guy. So here are just a couple of her early mysteries. So these are sort of 1910, 1915. And if you're noticing some big masculine energy in these dust jackets, it's no wonder. Women as authors of mysteries at this time were pretty unwelcome. There's actually a quote from a Los Angeles critic that I from this time period that I will share. He says, "Detective stories written by women do not, as a rule, promise much in the way of entertainment. They set at defiance every known law of reason and play havoc with the reader's credibility." So that's what he thought. But Carolyn just built herself a readership and became quite beloved for it. After she had written only a handful of mysteries, this company commissioned her to write The Technique of the Mystery Story. This was published in 1913. And this is the first history and how-to of the genre. She basically just kind of surveys a history of the genre. She goes over its finest examples. Basically, it's a lot of Poe, because she really loved Poe. She really loved Arthur Conan Doyle, so they're both in there a lot. But she also codified the rules of the game, quote unquote, what mystery lovers like to call the rules of the game, which later critics would actually kind of use against her, because they would say things like, hey, she said never to use a secret panel, and here she is using a secret panel in her book. So kind of came back to bite her a little bit. But she extolled basically 2 main philosophies in this book of her philosophy of mystery writing. One is up here. Why is the detective story? To entertain, to interest, to amuse. It has no deeper intent than to give pleasure to its readers. That's what she thought. This whole literary versus genre divide, she wasn't having any of that. She said, these books are for entertainment and interest. They're nothing more than that. And then she also kind of put forth this idea that a good mystery was like a good poem or a good puzzle, mechanical, almost like a math equation. And for a good while, that was the fashion in mysteries, the quote-unquote howdunit or the clue puzzler. But that would change, and unfortunately, Carolyn didn't quite keep up with the trends. She just kept doing what she was doing. Just to kind of give a quick overview of her film work, she worked on 16 different silent films between 1908 and 1927. She wrote what were called the scenarios or the stories, just a really basic plot summary of what the film would be. 8 of those films were done with Edison, with whom she became really good friends. And I think one here, this Mystery of West Sedgwick, based on her second novel, The Gold Bag. A lot of them were based on her novels, her mystery novels, but not all. His Hand and Seal, done by the Biograph Company in 1915, was based on one of her Fleming Stone stories that actually never became a book, was only published in Lippincott's magazine as a long, short story. And here are 2 others. One done with Paramount, The Woman Next Door in 1919, was based on her book Vicky Van. And there on the right is the last one she ever did, Dearie. That was an original story that she wrote. And what I love about this image, I don't know if you can see it from where you are, but Carolyn Wells her name is down there at the bottom in the fine print, but it's bigger than the director. So, she was the kind of sort of household name that, when they're doing the movie poster, her name is bigger than the director's, which I love. So you can see here on the left, Vicky Van. That's the novel I just mentioned that one of the films was based on. This was published in 1918. It was a bestseller at the time, and it's considered by some critics to be her finest mystery novel. So if you're going to think about, I'm going to read one by Carolyn Wells. This is one that people will recommend to you, kind of very of its time. I would say that's what most critics would say. It's not necessarily my favorite, but that's what most critics would say. And also G.K. Chesterton liked it a lot. He actually wrote about it twice, how much he liked this novel. But also I just wanted to show you some of the dust jacket art, because it's really beautiful, really Art Deco and lush. And when you see all of her novels laid out, I actually did this thing on Instagram where I posted the cover of each of these for 82 days. And then to go back and look at them, they're just like a splash of color. It's just beautiful to look at, in my opinion. Okay, some of you New Yorkers may know what this building is right here. Anybody? No? Hotel des Artistes. It's on West. It's right on the park on 67th. One West 67th, I think, is west. Yes, it says right there. So in 1918, Carolyn Wells surprises everyone, probably including herself, and gets married. She's 55, he's 62, and I guess he sweeps her off her feet because she was, an avowed, I won't call her spinster, but, was living at home and quite happy and had her own, writing career and everything else. She marries a man named Hadwin Houghton, which everyone thinks, Houghton, he's the publishing Houghton. He was not the publishing Houghton. Of course, that was his family, but he did not work in publishing. He worked in the paint and varnish industry. And very little is known about him. Very little is known about how they met. But when they got married, he moved her to New York City, to this building, which had just been built. And she actually ends up living there for the rest of her life, even though, unfortunately, Hadwin dies a little over a year after they get married. So she has a year or so where, she has this sort of wedded bliss of living in New York City and being married and all of that. That ends, but she decides to stay in the city. She starts joining all kinds of social clubs and bookish groups like the Authors League and the Colony Club and the Dickensian Club and the 12th Night Club. And she really begins to establish herself as the, quote, dean of American detective novels. And here she is, kind of looking like that. They're just asking her here why women read detective stories. Like, this is a question to ask, which is really the only reason I have this slide here. Is I'm just kind of fascinated that this is a question they would ask her to address. But I guess in 1930, this is a question they would ask her to address. And she kind of just bats it around. Like, when I read her answer here, it's kind of like, why not? And then she tries to give a few answers, but she kind of just gives up on it because it's a bogus question. Here are some of her later period mysteries. Murder in the Bookshop, which I mentioned before, is there in the center. That was a bestseller in 1936. It's probably her most well-known book at this point, and probably where a lot of people start with her. You can find copies, you can find a reprint that's available. In terms of finding her work out there in the world, a lot of it is now available because it's public domain. A lot of it is public domain. You can find it through your library, through Kindle editions, some audio editions. But this one actually has its own printed reprint edition. So, and I have the Tapestry Murder one here too, which I really like. It's one that she dedicated to President Hoover. My longtime friend who lives up to the presidential tradition of liking detective stories, which they actually were friends. She and both of the Hoovers, Mr. and Mrs. Hoover. So I have these here. I wanted to show you the jackets, obviously, but I mentioned before that she felt that the puzzle was the heart of the mystery, and even when that begins to fall out of favor, she kind of continues doing that, and that's because it's what her readers had come to expect. It's what she liked doing, and she claimed not to care about reviews because, in her words, the books, quote, sell like hotcakes anyhow. And she was right. Actually, most of her Fleming Stone books averaged about 13,000 copies each, which is amazing in its time. It would be great today, but in its time is amazing. The only person in her direct competitor who outsold her was Mary Roberts Rinehart, who was very often a bestseller, very often right above her. But as the years go on and as we get into the 30s when her health is declining, the quality of the novels does drop off. And Kirkus Reviews, for example, started reviewing her books with these little punny phrases like, "Guess Wells gone dry," and "All's well that ends wells." I mean, just really were very brutal. But I think it's worth pointing out that over 82 titles, there were some that were well reviewed, there were some that were poorly reviewed, and there was a lot in between. In fact, having read through hundreds, if not thousands, of reviews of her books, most tilted toward positive, which to me is a really important point in considering whether Carolyn was a good writer or a bad writer, which is a question I get a lot. My question is, what did her contemporaries think of her? So obviously she was selling well, right? Public libraries loved her. There was a survey of most read fiction in the Chicago area public libraries from 1936 that put her behind Zane Grey, who was actually #1 on that list, the great Western writer, but well ahead of Agatha Christie and absolutely crushing Virginia Woolf. All of which to say, critics be damned, I guess. I don't know. She also published in pulp magazines like Thrilling Detective, which one of the things I love about this is, while she's publishing in something like Thrilling Detective, she's also publishing poetry in the New Yorker. Like how she's straddling this highbrow, lowbrow thing, she's just not caring. She's just going about, she's just writing and sending it out to editors and seeing who wants it, and whoever wants it gets it, and then she just moves on. She doesn't hold grudges. She is fast. She doesn't really necessarily have an agent either in many cases, so she's doing this all herself. Very often writing to editors things like, let me know if you want this within 48 hours because I've got 10 other editors I can send it to. She was very bold in that sense. She also became, first editor of the Best American Mystery Stories series, which is still going strong today. She edited the first 2 volumes of that series. In 1937, she published her autobiography, The Rest of My Life, which is there are no names or dates or any. It's very useless if you want to learn facts about her life. But if you want some great storytelling, it's great storytelling. Very breezy, very nonlinear, and was actually really interesting to read as a stream of consciousness kind of memoir of her life. The New York Times liked it actually. They called it, original and enjoyable. So I think it's probably at this point where we can consider her legacy. After her death, there was some mismanagement of her estate, and aside from a few specific bequests, she left everything to her maid and did not appoint a literary executor who would have been able to advocate for her, particularly in the case of reprints and paperback editions, which were very important during World War II. She died in 1942. This is exactly when the paperback boom is happening in the United States, and unfortunately, she's not part of that paperback boom. So there was no one to save her archive from going to auction, which is what happened to it, and her books kind of just slowly disappear from the shelves. And that's a sad note, so we're not going to end on that one. We're going to end on another unusual facet of Carolyn's life and legacy is that she had always been a collector. She collected autographs from all of her famous friends and for decades, for 30 or 40 years. And not just autographs, but pieces of art on paper, inscriptions, poems that they would write and give to her. And she had them bound in this amazing autograph album, which she called At the Sign of the Mermaid. It's bound in gilt red Morocco, and this is a very one and only thing that really remains in the hands of her family. It's sort of the heirloom volume that they have. And you can see here the hand-drawn title page for the Mermaid book. She called it The Mermaid. You can see an illustration by Charles Dana Gibson there in the center, the Gibson girl Gibson. Theodore Roosevelt signed the page here on the right from the White House in 1903. They were very good friends. But it wasn't until her husband died, like I said, they got married in 1918. He dies a little over a year later. He dies, and then her friends kind of coax her into trying rare book collecting. I guess at this point she's got some money, both from her own royalties and also from what she's been left from her husband, and she's got, some time on her hands and wants to do something new. So she turns to three friends, and Belle de Costa Green, who some of you may know as J.P. Morgan's librarian, A. Edward Newton, who was a famous bibliophile and author. They were good friends. And her closest friend, Harriet Sprague. And they all kind of pushed her into collecting Walt Whitman. Some of you may recognize A. Edward Newton here on the left. Like I said, they were good friends. He had lived in Rahway for some part of his life, so they had that connection. And there's a copy here on the right. I put this here for the book collectors in the audience. This is a copy that I bought of Newton's book, The Amenities of Book Collecting, with this penciled note indicating that he autographed this copy at a dinner given for him by Carolyn Wells, which I love. So anyway, she was encouraged to collect Walt Whitman, and she set at it like on fire. She did not wait for booksellers to quote her things. She didn't wait for auctions to happen. She kind of just sat down and wrote letters to booksellers from here to Australia and basically just asked them, what do you have in terms of rare Walt Whitman books? And they wrote back, and she collected and collected till she had so much she had to hold an auction of her duplicates, and that was only 3 years later. So in the course of collecting all those books, and she's working with a bookseller named Alfred Goldsmith, they start putting together this bibliography, which they publish in a small edition of 500 copies. And this bibliography ends up being the Whitman bibliography for like 50 or 75 years. The one that everyone's using as a reference book, which is crazy because she's not a bibliographer. She's just an author and collector, and they're just she said at one point, this is not a bibliography, this is just a list of books, because she didn't feel she was quite up to that bibliography task. But I mean, it lasted forever. So like I said, she collected so much in the first 3 or 4 years of being a Walt Whitman collector that she had to have this auction of duplicates, which happens in October of 1923. You can see here the catalog on the left. Actually, A. Edward Newton did the introduction for this catalog. So she sells off some of her duplicates there. And then in the 1930s, she's told her health is not so wonderful. Actually, she's told in 1930 that she has only 2 years left to live, which ends up not being true. She lives another decade. But she is spooked enough that she starts looking for a home for her books. And as she's looking for a home for her books, she starts weeding out and selling some of her books, selections from her library in 1936. And then, unfortunately, when she dies, with many of her books still in the house, in the apartment, the maid who inherits them holds 2 auctions, one for books and one for everything else. So the catalog here on the right is from the 1942 book auction that disperses what's left of her library. What was not sold off was the core Walt Whitman collection, containing 100 editions of Leaves of Grass and a little bit more than that. And I got to visit this collection in January of 2023, right before my book was due, just to kind of commune with the books. I kind of had this vision that I could sort of just sit there and be surrounded by them and commune with them. But of course, as a researcher, you can't go to the Library of Congress and ask them if you can go commune with like a bunch of books. So they bring out the books, and the one thing I forgot to request was a Leaves of Grass that Walt Whitman had inscribed to Henry David Thoreau, which is in that collection, and I just kick myself for not asking for that one, because I felt like it would have been such a full circle moment, considering that my whole interest in this started with Thoreau. But alas, I'll have to get back to that one. This is what is probably the last photo of Carolyn from 1937. It's a press photo that I actually bought on Etsy for $40, which I was so excited about. What I love about it is that her library is there in the backdrop, and then in the foreground you've got some of her other collectibles, because she still collected things like silver and glass and all kinds of other little knickknacks. And yeah, so I've never seen another photo of her in her library or with her books, so to me it's quite special for that reason. Sorry?
Did the seller know it was Carolyn Wells?
They did, because it's a press photo. So it was a photo taken from like some newspaper's morgue, you know, that had been sitting around for decades. And that's really the end. I mean, this is my book. It's kind of the product of either 3 years or 13 years, depending on how you count. And my entire intent was really just to make her name be known. I feel like if we're going to talk about people like Agatha Christie all the time and Mary Roberts Reinhardt, there's no reason why